Tonight, we look forward to a budget informational item. This is part 2 of the 4-part series on mill levy and bond basics. And joining us this evening is Dave Montoya, our district's Chief Finance Officer. Dave, welcome.
Thank you. Good evening. So tonight we're going to be talking about bond and mill levies in Colorado. And this is, as Superintendent Kingsley has announced, this is the second part of a 4-part series. The last board meeting, we actually went through a lot of total program funding, and we're going to touch on that a little bit tonight. But again, we're really talking about bonds and mill levies tonight. So, I didn't know I was going to do that. Okay, let's see. Okay, so important terms. The first couple terms here are often used even by me, unfortunately. Sometimes they're used synonymously. So I thought it would be good to maybe break them down a little bit because there is distinction between these terms. The first one is we're going to talk at times about a mill rate. What that is it's really a tax rate, and it represents $1 in property tax levied per 1,000 of assessed valuation. So that's the term there. And then if we refer to a mill rate, it's actually it's a rate or a taxing rate. The mill levy is the property tax that's applied to the base on the assessed value of that property. So that's the actual property tax that comes from that. And then mill levies are used for various different things. Mill levies drive the mill levy overrides. They drive debt-free mill levy overrides, and they drive bonds. They're just all taxing rates, right? And so these other ones are just other variants where we're really getting into what is the tax. So the mill levy override is another term that, again, often they're used synonymously with the ones above. This is really where we're asking for more money beyond our total program funding. Debt-free mill levy override, the one that is going to be on the 2024 November ballot, is a unique kind of override. It's a different variant of a mill levy override. It's called a debt-free override, and it's really ongoing revenue to fund maintenance and infrastructure needs. And then the third or the fifth key term here is bonds. And bonds are just borrowing instruments for capital needs that temporarily increase property taxes. So it's another form at getting at capital needs that's beyond a mill levy. But we'll go through these in some detail as we go through the presentation tonight. Last week, or not last week, but the last board meeting, we talked a lot about total programming, and that's shown on this ring in that big blue bar. And we talked a lot about that being 74% of our general fund revenue. And just as reference, our general fund is $425 million. That includes our district charter schools. And the total program funding is the largest source of revenue. And that's what we talked about quite a bit last time. I'm going to touch on it again tonight, just because I think repetition is important. It also kind of drives the reason why do we need to go for additional money beyond total program, of which is displayed in this orange color here as mill levy overrides. So after tonight, we will have gone through 74% of the program funding and another 15% for mill levy overrides. I think my math gets to about 89% of the budget at that point. But just with these two presentations, we've covered the majority of the revenue that the district gets. There are a number of other sources of revenue that the district gets that we're not going to necessarily talk about tonight. There are a lot of little pieces. The third largest one, though, and that's shown in this gray color, is our categorical funding. And categorical funding makes up about 4% of our budget. So, and really what categorical means is it's program funding that's specific. So think about transportation reimbursements or integrated services funding. Those are items that the state does fund some programming, but again, it's only like 4% of our budget. So looking at the components of school district budgets, again, the total program is determined by the School Finance Act, and that includes both local and revenue sources. This is a little bit of repeat from the last session that we had. We also have federal programs within our district. Think about like title programs, IDA, Head Start, Early Head Start are big federal programs. Talked about the categoricals. That's about 4% of our general fund budget. Again, transportation, English language learners, gifted and talented is another small piece of revenue we get here. There's a lot of little pieces that come in through categoricals. And then we get to the bonds and mill levy overrides, of which is a major source of revenue for a school district that participates in those. And then we also have some grants. Even though the grants in comparison to the overall budget, yes, we do have grants, but they're not as large as the overall budget. And often many of the grants are in the form of those federal programs like Title, IDA. So those are funding. the funding items. So kind of coming back to what Brian Gustafson talked about last time, and this is just to kind of re-concrete this into knowledge here, is total programming is really set by the legislature, and it's through a formula, and it really is a mechanism that looks at a base per pupil amount. It starts to adjust for factors like cost of living, size, and then we multiply that times enrollment to get our total program funding. We also learned at the last session that PSD is a floor-funded district, meaning that it receives the least amount of funding available to districts in the state. We have looked a little closer, and historically we used to be 14 other districts at the floor. Currently in this run, there's 8 districts on the floor, so that has changed a little bit over time. We also talked last time about total program funding being a complement of both local and state share, but neither one of those sources of revenue define the program. The program is actually defined in the formula above. The way this formula works, and we saw this, we're going to see it again with the water glasses, is that as property taxes collections increase, especially when assessed valuation is increasing, that doesn't necessarily mean that school funding is increasing, because what we learned is that the state actually reduces by a complementary amount when that happens. And then kind of the other takeaway here is that whenever we want additional revenue beyond what's provided by the state in the total program funding formula, what we need to do is go to our local voters and ask for that. And that comes in the form of mill levies and bond questions that we find on the ballot. So, well, we remember this picture quite a bit. I know we've used it a lot. But it really kind of drives home the challenge or the issue that we had this last session when assessed valuation increased across the entire state. What happened was, and it's exactly what we were just talking about, is as the local share increased, the state share just decreased by a complementary amount, because the state's obligation, think of these as water glasses, the state's obligation is to fund to the top of the water glass. And the water glass is defined by that number of students times the base funding plus the factors. But neither source, local or state, define what the top of the glass is. It just defines how the glass is filled up. So to collect more funding beyond this total program, districts do need to go out for voter approval for overrides and bonds. That's the mechanism that the state has allowed and has authorized us to do that. So let's get into bonds and mill levies. And we're going to talk about 3 big categories here. The first one is we're going to talk about the mill here. And it's a unit of measure for property taxes. And so, for example, in the total program funding formula that we just talked about in that last water glass, PSD in the state formula collects 27 mills toward its total program. So I'm going to go back to this other slide. So what happens is if the tax rate is holding constant and the assessed valuation is going up, what's happening, and it's depicted in this graph here, the local share goes up. So that's exactly what's happening in the total program, because that mill rate is defined in state statute. And it actually came back, it was actually a relic after the Ritter administration. They did a mill levy freeze that brought this about, and we were slightly above 27 mills at that time, and that new legislation put a cap at 27 mills, so we dropped down to the cap and then we froze there. And then the idea behind that mill levy freeze is that it wasn't going to change. And what this was doing for the state many, many years ago was it was slowly eroding, because the state was having to fill more and more in when assessed valuation wasn't high back in the past. So those 27 mills are different than mill levy overrides. Those are the 27 mills that I'm talking about here are defined in that total program, or in this glass here, the total program funding formula. So to go beyond total program, we need to look at other mechanisms. And there's really 2 big mechanisms that we have, and then there's a couple variants of the mill levy override. The first one is a bond. And we as a district have done bonds. And when you think about a bond, it's really simple. It's very similar to what you do at home. If you want to buy a property, you usually go to a bank, you get a loan. They loan you the money or the cash to go do that, and then your obligation to that bank is to pay back that loan over time in the form of principal and interest payments. So that's exactly how bonds work, except that instead of going to a bank, we're actually going to investors in the market to market bonds. But it's a very similar concept. The same holds true that when we issue a bond, what we do is we get one-time collection of cash to do things with. And so we've built schools with that. We often do maintenance with that, but it's one time. Once it's spent, it's gone. And then on the other side of that, we do need to pay interest on that over the course of that agreement. And typically bonds go out typically 20 to 24 years. And so you're going to be paying interest on that over the course of that time frame of 20 to 24 years. So you need to keep that in mind because that is a cost of doing this. It's a cost of borrowing. The last major category here is a mill levy override. And there's a couple variants of this. One is the debt-free mill levy. But let's just talk about overrides in general. Voter approved, what it is, it's a voter approved tax that provides additional ongoing funding beyond the water glasses or that total program funding. In a normal mill levy override, so I'm not talking about a debt-free mill levies in this case, overrides cannot exceed 27% of the total program, and that's defined in state statute. So again, we're going back to that total program, and what the state's saying is you can go out and ask for more money above and beyond total program, but you're limited to 27% of that. We currently do have a little bit of capacity, but our last 2019 override, we did go closer to it was actually a 25% cap at that time, and we came pretty close to that with that override. So this is one mechanism. It's one we've used in the past. We actually have 6 overrides that the district has passed. We'll look at those in a little bit later, but they really start back from 1988. And then the last thing is, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, can I interrupt you? Connor had a question, I think.
Sure.
I think you're getting to it. The 27% of total program, that is cumulative for all the overrides or one individual override?
It's cumulative for all traditional mill levy overrides. Okay, now, and my key word there is traditional. I'm using traditional because the debt-free schools is a different kind of mill levy. It doesn't use that same 27% cap.
Do we retire mill levy overrides?
So mill levy overrides do not
They're
retire over
perpetuity,
time because they're ongoing revenue. And so once you typically use them in an ongoing way, that ongoing need is going to be there for quite a while. So think about the 2019 override that we did for salaries. Once we put that money into salaries, that is in salaries. The only way you could get it out is by reducing salaries again. And so you need to have that ongoing support to pay for that over and over and over again. Mill levy overrides come in every year, and they in theory would go in perpetuity. I guess that the state legislature could change law and do something like that. But as it currently stands, they would be in perpetuity, and that's how they've operated.
So at a certain point, I think I was picking up what you're putting down here, Connor. At a certain point, maybe not this board, but a certain board is going to exhaust the capacity for PSD to seek additional mill levies because we're going to be at 27%, more or less, right?
In the traditional mill levy override. Now, the debt-free schools is a different kind of override, but the 6 that we have are these traditional mill levy overrides. And as I had mentioned, the 2019 override, we came close to that cap. We didn't quite get to the cap, but we intentionally came pretty close to that in that override. And so you're right, there is a point where you can't ask for more. Now, keep in mind, total program theoretically will grow with inflation every year. There's some things that grow, so over time you build some capacity. But yes, there is a limit to those typical traditional mill levy overrides.
Dave, really quickly on that inflation piece. I know that the 2019 mill levy override had an inflation component
Yes.
to it. That inflation component, can that not exceed a certain limit? Or I'd assume it's set at CPI, something like that. But if that inflation piece tips us over the 27%, does the state take that portion back, or we're not allowed to collect it from the taxpayers?
We haven't hit that point yet, and I don't think we're going to do it anytime soon. But I believe what would happen is we would be limited in how much we could collect at that point. So we would actually probably have to adjust that last override to meet the cap. But again, we have some capacity in there. The other piece of capacity really is that this cap used to be 25%. Last year, the legislature added another 2%, making it 27%, giving a little bit more flexibility to districts that were using this type of override.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so bonds. We're going to talk about bonds now, and just again, kind of repeating this a little bit. We have used bonds in this district, and in Colorado, they've been historically used quite a bit. In fact, when we talk about capital and maintenance, districts were often left with bonds as really one of their only alternatives to fund some of those type activities. Again, a reminder here that bonds are one-time funds, so you're borrowing money and then you're spending the money, and then you have to pay that back with principal and interest. This data is lagging by a year in a couple slides here, but it was a good source of data that had it all together. When we look across 32 school districts in Colorado, last year in the 23-24 year collected around $1.5 billion in bond funding. And so that was something that happened last year. Now bonds are interesting because it's not ongoing. And so there's times where a district may be collecting for a bond, and then there's going to be times where maybe they're done with that bond. So that does ebb and flow quite a bit. But that was the kind of the statistic from last year. And then some interesting things around a bond. So like for us, our most recent bond, our 2016 bond, what that did is it did a number of things for us. It did the construction at Timnath Middle High School as well as Wellington Middle High School. It also did construction at Bamford Elementary. We did some classroom space in the form of an addition at Zach Elementary. We had an addition of a transportation facility that's right outside here over kind of kitty corner to where we're at. And then we also had limited maintenance included in that bond. We had a $40 million maintenance line item in there for maintenance in all schools. And then the bond, again, it's one-time money or cash, and so we're reaching the end of that bond program. And in all likelihood, we'll probably exhaust all funds by next year. Depending on the situation after November, we'll try to stretch this out as far as we can, but we're coming to a point where we're going to exhaust the bond funds, and we're not going to have much else to do maintenance with. So that's bonds, and then let's look at mill levy overrides across the state too. And districts in Colorado do heavily rely on mill levy overrides. Unfortunately, the truth behind it is, though, that not all districts are capable of seeking either bonds or mill levy overrides, honestly. Often it has to do with voter support. Will your voters support it, for one? But the other piece is that it really has a lot to do with property wealth, too. So if you're trying to raise taxes on property, like let's say in the Eastern Plains where the value of the property is not much, you have to tax it pretty hard to get dollars generating that you're going to see, that you're going to notice. And so what you're going to see, and like when we look across Colorado, there's 124 school districts that do participate in some type of mill levy override, and that totals about $1.7 billion across the state in 23-24. But not all districts are getting this. And so again, it goes back to there's an equity issue that the state's really wrestled with for a long time with how do you navigate this fact that the districts that have the ability to go and ask for more money can, but then other districts that don't have that ability can never get ahead. And so when we look across the state, what you find is those districts without overrides are typically concentrated on the Eastern Plains or in the southern San Luis Valley, where the property value and the wealth is just not there or the voter support is not there. Another interesting statistic as I was preparing this is Pueblo is the only Front Range metropolitan district that doesn't have a mill levy override. So all the other large districts do, and we're going to see that in a second. And then PSD does collect less funding through mill levy overrides than comparable districts. So we do collect overrides, but as I mentioned, there's 124 districts doing this. Some are collecting more than we are. So let's look at that. This first graph and chart here depicts the mill levy overrides. And what I did is I just, I looked across the entire state and said, okay, if you're bringing in more than $25 million annually in an override, I'm going to put you on the graph. And so you can see how that displays, and it starts out with Greeley 6 on one end and Denver or DPS on the other end at the extreme end. Now keep in mind these are total dollars collected. So yes, a larger district most likely will be collecting more dollars. But you can kind of see where Poudre falls in this, and Poudre's really kind of that circle in the middle where we're kind of on the tail end. We're not quite on total collections with our neighbors right to the left of us. But as we look at to the other side of that, there are districts that are collecting quite a bit more that are even similar in size, like St. Vrain, Boulder, to call out a few. Cherry Creek, Jefferson County, obviously those are much bigger districts. So that's one way to look at overrides. I think another way to look at it, and probably a more telling way to look at that, is to actually divide those numbers by the funded pupil count in the district. And what this does is it normalizes it to a per pupil revenue amount so that we can actually compare across districts. And so again, yes, we kind of advance a little bit up there on a per pupil basis, but we still are kind of in the middle of the pack as far as those districts that I've identified as far as collecting these overrides. And you can see, once you adjust for this, I found it interesting, I didn't even realize this until I put it together, is that St. Vrain, Thompson, Boulder, Colorado Springs, these are all districts that we compare to a lot. They're very similar to us. They are all on a per pupil basis collecting more in mill levy overrides than we are. So I guess the takeaway is that yes, we have used mill levy overrides in this district, but we're not necessarily using them out of order than other districts would be that we compare to. So it's something that has been happening for quite a while. Looking back in history here, and there's a lot of history here, but we do have 6 overrides, and I thought I would just kind of walk through basically what's in each one of them, and then I'll call out the dollar amounts just for people that might be listening. But the first override was back in 1988. That was quite a while ago, and really, I tried to put this on one line. It was really enhancements to the educational environment, and keep in mind, these are people that had a 1980s mindset back then. Very different probably than what we'd be thinking about as educational environment now. But we did collect $3 million from that override. And again, kind of the question earlier about do these continue? Yes, these are in perpetuity, so we continue to collect them. So the 1988 override was the first one that happened. I wasn't here when that happened or when we did that election, but it was $3 million. The next one, we'll go through these quicker. The 1996 was really focusing on technology and staffing levels at that time. Again, kind of highlighting, this is 1990s, right? So technology in the 90s is very different than technology we're buying today. It's not even comparable, right? But we were thinking about asking our voters, we need some support for technology even back in the 90s. That override is just under $6 million. The 2000 override was really used in conjunction with a bond program at that time. So we built some schools. We actually staffed those schools with mill levy override dollars. That was a big use there. And then that override is about $10 million annually. And then we get into the ones that I actually was involved with on a detail level. The first one that I was involved with is a 2010 levy. And this one is a $16 million override. And this one really was the big push where we brought in, again, talking about technology evolved a lot over time. This is where the one-to-one devices started coming in. And this election is really what moved us off the dime and being able to actually put devices in front of students so that we could have that as part of their curriculum and their learning. Other things that were in that 2010 override, keep in mind, the recession just happened. There were a number of restoration of staffing positions that got reduced, and I had kind of forgot about that. That was a part of that, but it was a part of that back in 2010. Moving forward, the second to the last override that we've had is our 2016 override. That's $8 million. And again, that was really tied closely to us bringing on the new schools from the 2016 bond, very similar to what happened in 2000. So much of that was used for materials, equipment, staffing for the new schools. When you think about adding middle school, high schools, we added enormous acreage. We added enormous square footage. We added, new feeder patterns. This took more staff to actually pull off. We needed more people to service the outdoor because we have more acreage. So that override was really designed to go hand in hand with that 2016 bond so that we could actually staff the buildings that we were building and actually provide the support that they need. The last one is the 2019 override. That was the most recent one. It was passed originally at $18 million. This is the only override out of the 6 overrides that I'm talking about tonight that is indexed to inflation. So current dollars, this year's budget is $22 million. So basically it has increased by $4 million since inception. Keep in mind, we went through some very high inflation rate times, so that's reflected in that number. But this override really went to competitive salaries as well as some enhancements to mental health and security. I always think it's very important at this point to pause and acknowledge that we would be a very different district if we did not have this slide. Our local voters are what distinguishes us from a mediocre district to a district that can do what we do. That's what pulls this off. We would not be Poudre School District without our voter support here. In total, this is $65 million coming into the district. It's a large portion. It's the second largest portion next to total program. But it has been done over 6 years, and we have a good record of moving forward with these things and actually utilizing them well. So that gets us into what's coming on the ballot. And so to be thorough in this presentation, I wanted to talk about another mill levy override. It's still a mill levy override. It's just it doesn't have that 27% cap that's tied to total program. It's a little different because the legislature, what they were trying to do was trying to get us out, and this actually passed in 2016. It says 2019, but it was 2016 legislative session. And what they were really trying to do is get districts out of that bad habit of issuing bonds and then paying principal and interest over time for things that really didn't belong in a bond or a mortgage, so to speak. So what it did is allowed us to move away from relying bonds, and again, paying that principal and interest, and look at something that's more fiscally responsible. So what it is, it's an ongoing revenue source. Again, this one will be indexed to inflation if approved. So it would grow over time. And that's important because these maintenance and infrastructure needs that we've identified are also going to grow and inflate over time. So it's important that that revenue source keeps up with that escalation over time. The debt-free schools levy is a newer option that's available. Honestly, if it was available prior to 2016, we probably would have been talking about it when we were doing the 2016 bond. It kind of came out when we had actually passed the election already, so it was a little bit late. But it is a new option. It is something that districts are finding a lot of advantage to doing, and it's very helpful. So kind of coming back to the debt-free mill levy too, so how does this work for a debt-free mill levy, and how are we thinking about the one that potentially is on the ballot, that's going to be on the ballot in November? So the debt-free mill levy is going to be $49 million, again, indexed to inflation. What we've identified is really three categories that this mill levy would be used for. The first category is $21.5 million. And what this category is we would actually look at our existing general fund, go through and identify anything that's building maintenance, infrastructure, replacement type function, and actually move it to the new debt-free mill levy source and actually free up that $21 million to do other things like salaries, classroom materials, technical and career and technical education, and support for our small neighborhood schools. So that is not necessarily gaining anything new. What we're doing is we're moving existing maintenance and infrastructure over. We're going to continue that. The new is being able to retarget that budget to those other purposes. So that's exciting, and that's something new, and that's something that would be utilized if the election is successful. The next one is $22.9 million, and this is really the balance of which isn't going to charter schools, so it's kind of the plug. It's $22.9 million, and this would be dedicated to new building maintenance, repairs, and replacement cycles. As we talk about this option, it's important to understand that right now we budget approximately $800,000 toward this effort, and we've talked a lot in a lot of settings that is not adequate for this district going forward. This is the solution potentially if approved by the voters. The last piece is that the charter schools do get a pro rata share of PSD of any mill levies that we collect. And so we've calculated that to be about $4.6 million of the $49 million. All of this information is on the website, so I encourage anybody that's watching from home, you can see the link down there below. It's also on our homepage. You can go look at some of the factual information out there. So kind of wrapping this up tonight, key takeaways around bonds and mill levies. Let's keep in mind, I mean, I really probably should start out with this all the time, but I'm so used to it that I forget it sometimes. Colorado is among the lowest in the nation as far as funding goes. And I've been a native of Colorado. I don't know anything else other than Colorado, so I know Colorado. But when you look across the country, Colorado is really at the lower end of the range. And there's various different studies, but no matter which one you look at, we're at the bottom. And so that's concerning. And then to add that on, I like the doom and gloom sometimes. And then thinking about total program, okay, we're the lowest in the nation, and then we're the lowest in the state. So that doesn't feel good at all, right? So that's important to understand. And so when when the school finance formula is not providing enough resources to do what we need to do, what we need to do is we need to go out and ask our voters for that support. And then the last piece is that states that when we rely on voter-approved bonds and mill-levy overrides to offer comprehensive programming to students and to complete construction and building material maintenance. So the idea here is that the School Finance Act is not doing any of this. And so there's no line item in School Finance Act for infrastructure or buildings or any replacement cycle items. In the very distant past, there was some money that was where the state told us to carve off a piece of total program and put it to those items. That went away during the 9/10 recession because school districts started cutting into these programs, the construction, the ability to do maintenance. I mean, this started back in 9/10. And so that was something that was happening way back when, and we're still kind of feeling the repercussions of that. And so, yeah, that is the end of the presentation. I can take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much. Kevin, did you have a question?
Just a comment. I want to highlight two things. Dr. Hooten put together the website and in our dinner session highlighted some of the information for our community. If you missed one of the information sessions last night, there's another this Thursday at Fossil Ridge, another Wednesday, October 2nd at Timoth Middle High at 6 p.m., another the following evening on Thursday, October 3rd at 5:30 p.m. at Wellington Middle High, then Wednesday, October 9th, 6 p.m. at Rocky, Tuesday, October 15th, 5:30 at Collins, and Thursday, October 17th at the Future Ready Center inside Foothills Mall. So there's a ton of, to get this presentation, bring a friend, bring a neighbor, bring someone who's curious about why we're doing this and what's going to be on the ballot, why it's important. It's a very good, digestible yet comprehensive presentation that staff's putting on. Board members will be there to answer some Q&As. I find it immensely helpful. The more I sit through it, I still glean things each presentation. So plug for that. Go to the website, psdschools.org under the community section, and then there's a 2024 mill levy tab.
Thank you for that. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead, Connor.
Dave, quickly, correct me if I'm wrong. The 2000 mill levy override and the 2016 mill levy override were both in conjunction with bonds, so there was 2 actual votes on those ballots that passed?
In those years, we actually did have 2 questions on the ballot.
Anyone else?
And that's actually not unusual. You often see a district that passes a bond for construction to pass a similar mill levy override to help staff the building.
And if you're in a district like where I grew up, you pass the bond, but not the mill. And therefore you build the school, but don't open it because you don't have the ability to staff it.
There have been some school districts that have run into that problem very
Yeah.
close to our vicinity.
Yeah. So it happened where I grew up. So it's, and one of the things I want to point out too is if you go back to the slide where you're talking about all of the mill levies overrides from 1988 on, I just want to point out too that, and you mentioned this, but it's only the 2019 one that goes with inflation. So all of those other ones that you're looking at, 88, 96, 2000, 2010, 2016, those are flat numbers. And 10 million in technology staffing in 1996 bought a lot more technology and a lot more staffing than it does today. So that's another thing to keep in mind is that while we've asked for these monies over the course of the years, what it purchases us in both staffing and in things absolutely decreases over time. So I just wanted to really highlight that.
There's another thing that I would like to highlight there too, is that when we're collecting for specific dollar amounts, even the ones that are growing by inflation, because we're still collecting to a specific dollar amount, right? Remember the math. Assessed valuation, when it goes up, our tax rate will go down because we're still collecting the same dollar amount. The tax doesn't necessarily, these taxes don't necessarily ebb and flow with the net assessed valuation because we're still collecting the same dollar of tax. with the caveat that 2019 does grow with inflation, just to be completely transparent on that.
Dave, just another curiosity question. On the debt-free mill override, have there been any districts who, or we could use an example here, let's say in 1 year, we can't get to all of our projects, and there's $5 million left. We have projects for the next year, we just can't execute them because we don't have the contractors or we don't have the materials available. What is the process for carrying that money over? And do you get penalized? Do you have to give it back? What happens with that?
No, and in fact, thinking of this kind of funding stream and what it would be used for, it would be expected that things are going to cross fiscal years, especially when we're doing most of our construction in the summer. That's always a challenge for us. The funds from the debt-free schools levy will be kept in a separate fund, separate of general fund, so that we can follow it, track it, and any money in there would continue to stay in there. We wouldn't take it out and use it for something else. It would continue to be needed to be used for that infrastructure, the replacement cycles, all of those things.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but in the mill levy language itself that you'll see on the ballot, it says that there's an oversight committee that will be in charge of that.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
Thanks.
Not only will it be in a separate fund, but the fact that it's in a separate fund will make it easier for an oversight committee to see what activity is going on in there, because it's all going to be housed under one fund.
Perfect.
And when I
just
talk
want-
about funds for the public, what I'm talking about is, think about different bank accounts.
Yeah, and I
segregated.
want people to understand that this is, that we are, as far as transparency goes, this is going to be one of the easier ones because it will be separated out and it will have an oversight committee and it will be able to, we'll know what we're using the monies for.
Yeah.
Anything else? Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Dave, thank you, one, for the presentation again. I really appreciate how educative you are in the role that you play in our system. Can you go to the graph where you break down the mill levy overrides per pupil?
Yep.
So I think one of the things that I just want to ground us as a governance team and as a community is, last presentation, we talked about what it meant. We talked a little bit about tonight too, what it means for us to be a floor funded district as a result of a not heavy concentration of at-risk students. We're not benefiting from a cost of living adjustment. There's a third criterion,
Size.
the size. Because of us being the 8th largest school system in the state, we're not benefiting financially from that too. When you look at the school districts to the right, with the exception of Thompson, those school districts that are getting more per pupil in mill levy overrides are also getting more per pupil in total program. So when you look at what that amount compounded per pupil in all these different funding sources, we're falling even further behind when you look at these different entities all in one spot. So I just think it's important for the community to realize that we're not just losing here, but we're losing in other places. And these are the districts that we're competing for, competing against, and trying to keep up with, not just in terms of basic investments, but also innovative practices. So I just thought it was important to name that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Sorry, I'm feeling your context spirit, Brian. In the context too, in the presentation we had last night, we'll keep having, I think it's also important for, this is high level, this is very important to digest and understand this, but to the average tax voter that may have kids in our school, may not, they want to know how much our property taxes are going up. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's at a baseline of $100,000 per value per house. What that's going to result in, if this passes, a little over $25 per $100,000 per house. I don't think we have that slide in this presentation, but the gist is, if your property home value is around $700,000, that will yield around an additional 200 and change. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's 256 maybe.
It's on the website.
It's
So
on the website.
yeah, so if you go to that mill levy override website, what it shows you is that for a $700,000 residential home value, that your tax increase per year would be $176, and your tax increase per month is $14.70.
Again, I think that's, I want it both macro and micro, the context, because I think it's important to this conversation.
Thank you for that. Other questions? No? All right. Thank you so much. Great
Thank you.
presentation.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, really appreciate it.